What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Dragonknight DPS. So magdks in this particular patch did get a bit of a nerf, mainly due to the fact that their sustain hasn't really gotten that much better. Yes, there was a change to their combustion passive to give it no cooldown. However, it didn't really help out magdk sustain overall. It's still one of the harder classes to sustain a full light attack rotation on. But when you compare their DPS output to other potential classes, it is still one of the harder hitting classes, Magicka classes out there right now, although it can be overshadowed by the Magicka Nightblade in terms of raw DPS. Now, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with Magicka DKs, they kind of fit this weird position in the DPS kind of specking order, mainly because while they do use Magicka as their primary resource, they compete for melee spots with stamina DPS. So often you'll see Magicka DK DPS being compared to stamina DPS, and it's mainly because they are competing for that melee spot there. So a lot of the times magdks are not really compared to other Magicka DPS, just because other Magicka DPS can usually play at range. Magdks are unfortunately are not able to do that without a significant DPS loss, so their DPS tends to get lumped together with stamina DPS, even though they are not really directly comparable, just because they're using different resources, different skills, things like that. So, like the rest of our build videos, we will not be going over gear. So if you guys want to know what gear I am running, be sure to click on the video up in the upper right hand corner. That is the separate Magicka DPS gear video. So go ahead and pause this video, take a look at that video so you guys can get a sense of what sort of gear you can be running on a Magicka Dragonknight. And then come back here, we'll be discussing skills and a talk about our rotation, and of course a 21 million W parse to kind of give you guys a point of comparison to the other Magicka DPS classes in the game right now. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So in terms of skills, starting off with our front bar, we're going to be running Molten Whip here, Burning Embers, Engulfing Flames, Degeneration here. This is a bit of a flex spot here, so you can swap Degeneration out for something like Soul Trap if you'd like. But Degeneration is generally going to give you the best results, partly because it does also provide some additional passives through the Mage's Guild passive, so it gives you Empower whenever you use it. It also gives you some additional Max Magicka and Magicka regen. So I would recommend sticking with Degeneration here. You could also replace this with Spell Symmetry if you'd like for some additional Magicka sustain if you need it. That way you still maintain the Magicka controller passive, but you would be giving up the damage from Degeneration. Next, we have Inner Light for the extra Magicka you're getting. Shooting Star for the Magicka controller passive. Not really the ultimate you'll be using for the most part. You'll typically be using Dragonknight Standard instead over here, Standard of Might. On the back bar here, we have Flames of Oblivion, Eruption, Blockade of Fire. You will notice that we're using Blockade rather than Unstable. Either morph will work, but Blockade will give you a little bit better sustain just because you don't have to cast it quite as often. Ultimately, the rotation will change because obviously they are different durations, but the rotation itself is dynamic. We'll go over that when we start going over our rotation. So the changing between Blockade and Unstable, the main difference here will be from sustain. The DPS difference leans a little bit more towards Unstable, but they're about the same DPS potential. Then we have Barbed Trap for minor force if you're able to be within melee range. If you are not able to be within melee range, you can use the other morph if you'd like, Lightweight Beast Trap, in order to use your secondary resource rather than using Magicka. Alternatively, you can run Channel Acceleration under the Sigil Order line if you have access to that line for the minor force instead. And finally, we have Mystic Orb. This is a pretty strong move, one of the strongest moves right now for Magicka DPS. This is also arguably a flex spot as well. You could replace this with a shield, for example, if you need a shield. But Mystic Orb is very powerful, especially in trash fights and for bosses with large hitboxes. So definitely a very powerful move that I would recommend having on hand. I already mentioned that you could take out Degeneration for something like Spell Sim. You could also move Mystic Orb up to the front bar if you'd like, and then put a shield ability here instead. Kind of up to you how you want to go ahead and do that. And our ultimate is going to be Standard of Might. Now there are a few skill options you might want to consider. So I already talked about using something like Channel Acceleration, for example. For our spammable here, Molten Whip is what I like to use. However, you could use Elemental Weapon instead. You can see here that the actual tooltip is going to be weaker, so in terms of raw damage, it'll be weaker. It does provide, if you have it, a Spell Orb passive, which does sort of help out DPS overall. And then, I don't have any of the passives here, so let me get the passives here. And then with Elemental Weapon, you can see in terms of cost, 2403 compared to 2065. So while you could use Ele Weapon, you get some additional burning, concussed, or chill status effects. It's not really worth it. You're just doing less damage overall for more Magicka, so you're better off running Molten Whip instead. Here, not much else here under the Ardent Flame line. On the Draconic Power, not much here again. And on the Earthen Heart, again, not really much here in terms of class abilities when it comes to swapping things out. You could use something like Igneous Weapons or Molten Armament for a source of major sorcery if you'd like, if you don't want to use Spell Power Potions. But generally speaking, that's not really going to be helpful. It's better just to use Spell Power Potions than to give up an ability slot for major sorcery. Under the Destro Staff line, very similar to Molten Whip, you could use Force Pulse instead, but just like with Elemental Weapon, you won't really be, you basically will have less sustain overall. Your DPS is going to be a little bit higher with Force Pulse compared to Elemental Weapon, but it's not really worth running Force Pulse. Again, it's just better off, you're better off running Molten Whip because it does a little bit more damage, and it just costs less, and sustain is a big component of builds in Dragonhold. Destructive Reach is no longer a good dot to maintain, so you're definitely going to end up dropping that. Impulse, specifically Elemental Ring, might be a good option to use if you have a Black Rose Prison Destruction Staff for trash fights, but other than that, you're not really going to be using Impulse at all. For your shields, you'll be using either Morph of Annulment, Harness Magicka, or Dampen Magic. It's your choice which one you want to use here. Harness Magicka will give you some Magicka back whenever you absorb damage. Dampen Magic will just give you a larger shield. So it's kind of up to you which one you want to go for here. Soul Trap, either Consuming Trap or Soul Splitting Trap. Soul Splitting is going to be better for AoE. Consuming is going to be better for a single target. In terms of damage done, Soul Trap is still a pretty decent dot. So it's kind of up to you if you want to run Soul Trap or not. Again, we're running Degeneration also for the Magicka controller passive with additional Max Magicka and Magicka Sustain. Magicka Regen that we're getting out of it. So not really all that necessary to run Soul Trap unless you want some additional cleave, in which case you would want to swap out for Soul Splitting Trap. You will notice that we are a vampire as well, so we are getting that 10% additional Magicka regen. I would say that vampirism is more important than ever in this increase, I should say, worse sustain that we're getting in Dragonhold, but you don't have to be a vampire if you don't want to. Not much here under the Fighters Guild, Mages Guild. Again, not much here. You could run Scalding Rune if you'd like. It does a pretty decent amount of damage for the initial hit, but the dot is not as strong as it used to be. Not really worth running for the most part. We already talked about Citric Order lines, and on the Undaunted line, not much here to talk about. Again, Mystic Orb is the only real ability you'd want to be running on the Undaunted line. Nothing under the Alliance War line. These are all support abilities, so you're going to be using these on support roles like tanks and healers, not so much on DPS. And that's pretty much covers it in terms of skills. So we're going to be moving on now to the actual rotation part of things. So first, let's go ahead and move our 21 million dummy Parse, 21 million dummy here, and we'll demonstrate our rotation on the 6 million dummy. So I mentioned this earlier, but the rotation is a little bit dynamic. So take a look at the duration of our dots. We have 14 seconds on Engulfing Flames and Burning Embers, 12 seconds on Degeneration. Blockade is 14 seconds. Eruption is 18, and Flames of Oblivion you can treat as a 15-second dot. And then Barbed Trap lasts for 18 seconds. So a little bit of varying duration here and there. Mystic Orbs also a 10-second duration here. So just something you want to keep in mind here. So 14-14, you have a couple of abilities that match up pretty nicely. Blockade with Engulfing and Burning Embers, but the other abilities don't really line up very well. So dynamic rotation basically involves just keeping an eye on all your dots, your timers on your dots, and just re-upping the dots as they start to fall off. That's pretty much it. You're not really centering your rotation around anything at all, and if all your dots are going and you don't need to renew them, that's when you just start using Molten Whip and using that as your spammable. So for example, we're going to be looking over the 6 million dummy here. You always want to start off with just getting minor force off right away, so whether that's Barbed Trap, Lightweight Beast Trap, or Challenge Acceleration, just make sure you're getting your minor force going. And there, you just start doing all your dots. So I typically like to start by just bringing down all of my back bar dots and then moving to my front bar dots. You can see here that you don't need to renew any dots, so we just use your spammable here, which is Molten Whip. And now we have dots running out, so once I finish my front bar dots, I go to the back bar, do Eruption, and then go back to using my spammable, Molten Whip, until I need to renew my next dot. And that is the entirety of the rotation there. So again, dynamic. So I will not have written rotation down at all. Please don't ask for a written rotation on any dynamic rotation. There is no written rotation because you're just keeping an eye on all your dots and renewing them once they start to run out. Now the trouble with dynamic rotation is sometimes you'll have a lot of different dots falling off at once. So which dot do you prioritize? Which dot do you put down first? Generally speaking, the most important dots for you to put down are going to be Blockade of Fire to maintain that Maelstrom effect, Barbed Trap, Lightweight Beast Trap, Challenge Acceleration, whatever you're using for the minor force. It's a pretty strong dot there. It's a pretty strong effect, I should say. And then Engulfing Flames for the 10% additional flame damage bonus. So those are the three most important dots to maintain. Everything else is kind of secondary to that. So Burning Embers, for example, while it is a pretty decent dot, you can let this run out for a few seconds. Eruption, same thing. You can let that run out for a little bit. It's a very strong dot compared to the other dots in the game. But again, it's not absolutely necessary because all it is just raw damage compared to Blockade or Engulfing Flames that have some sort of additional effect tied into it. Mystic Orb is another dot that you can want to try to maintain as best you can, but it's up to you if whether or not you want to use it every 10 seconds. It is a little bit expensive to use every 10 seconds or so. And then from there, again, all the dots kind of fall into place from there. So Degeneration, Burning Embers, and Eruption are all sort of secondary to Blockade of Fire, Barbed Trap, and Engulfing Flames. Then Mystic Orb, just kind of shoot it out wherever you can. So for large bosses, you won't want to wait the full 10 seconds, but on smaller bosses, you can probably re-up it once the Mystic Orb is completely out, is no longer hitting the boss. For the most part, though, it's just better off just to run it on the 10-second duration there. Then Engulfing Flames, you treat it as a 15-second dot, but you can let it run out for a little bit. It's perfectly fine for you to do that. Then, of course, for Standard of Might, there is a bit of an animation associated with Standard of Might. So what I like to do for Standard of Might, since that's the ultimate that we're going to be using, is I like to use it last on my back bar and then bar swap out of the animation. So you'll be able to see it when we do our 200 million dummy parse, exactly what I mean when I say I like to bar swap out of the animation itself. So we'll go ahead and reset the dummy here, and we will go ahead and do our 21 million dummy parse. So I mentioned at the beginning of this video that magdks are sometimes placed next to stam DPS in terms of where they rank in terms of DPS order, although that is a little bit inaccurate just because stam DPS obviously use different skills, different sets than Magicka DPS. So I personally like to compare them in general to Magicka DPS, although I do understand that in terms of raid performance, it's better off to compare them to stem DPS because those are the DPS you'd be competing with to fill in that spot. So we'll go ahead and do a 21 million W parse here, and I'm trying to narrate things, anything important or pertinent as we go along here. Here you'll see when I bar swapped out of that animation, you basically use the ability and then immediately hit your bar swap so that way you're not caught in the animation. Now on a magdk, might need to heavy attack once or twice. In order to complete our rotation. Sometimes I don't need to, but I guess we'll have to see whether or not I will need to do it. If you feel like you do need the sustain, for example, you are towards the end of the fight and you are running out of sustain, running out of magicka, and you have a shooting star ready to go, you have the ultimate for a shooting star. You could run shooting star if you know that you're about to finish the fight here. It's not improper to do that. So we have our standard, so pop the standard down and bar swap cancel out of that animation, so I'm not trapped in that animation at all. The advantage of running Blockade rather than Unstable Wall is it also gives you more time to use more spambles. We'll leave the heavy attack here. My standard did go up. I will want to use it last in order to get that animation cancel out. If you do not animation cancel, you'll be stuck in this sort of animation, which will slow you down a little bit because the actual duration of the animation is a little bit longer than a global cooldown. Time for one spam ball or do this. magdks do not have an execute, so as we go into execute stage here, around 25% health, nothing's going to be changing with our rotation at all. Oh, we're running real close to our limit here. Should be able to get one more standard off here. Our standard is out. That'll get us to the last bit here, so I'll re-up Engulfing, but then we'll just use our whip spamble all the way. The rest of the way, don't bother re-upping any dots. But as you get towards the end of a fight, you will find that it's usually more beneficial to drop some dots and just keep on using your spamble. So for example, you might drop Burning Embers, you might drop Eruption, and just keep on using Whip. And that's just because spammables, generally speaking, are going to be better use of your magicka than just continuing to renew dots. So in terms of actual DPS, I have gotten up to around 81k or so this is a little bit worse for me. So 79.1k, I think that heavy attack kind of took out some of the wind behind my sails, so to speak. But again, I have hit up to about 81k or so with this. I believe Lyco has managed to hit up to 88k. So magdks are in a pretty decent spot here. So as you can see here, Molten Whip up here, and then you have light attacks. And then I am using Absorb Magicka on the back bar in order to better sustain my rotation. If I didn't have the Absorb Magicka, it definitely would be a lot harder for me to sustain this overall rotation. So definitely recommend using an Absorb Magicka on your back bar for the additional resources that it's able to provide for you. But everything else from there is pretty standard. So Blockade of Fire, you can see here, is about 4.2k. With Unstable Wall, you will be getting higher DPS from Unstable Wall, just in terms of both the dot as well as the explosion part of it, but your sustain will be a little bit worse. So if you took a look at our overall sustain, pull up sustain here, magic percentage, you can see that especially towards the end, we were basically getting to very close to 0 magicka. So with unstable, this probably would have shifted over maybe another 20-30 seconds to around over here. So just keep that in mind if you do want to use unstable wall. You will have a little bit harder time sustaining just because you're using it a little bit more often than you would be using a blockade here. But that concludes this build video. If you guys have any questions about the build, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hopefully you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.